Welcome to I Got Back Up, Getting Back Up With. I'm Talia Lazarus, your host, and in August 2021, my whole life changed. I was in a road accident which led me to 10 weeks of no walking, 2 knee surgeries, and learning how to walk again in my 20s. My journey took me on a physical, emotional, and mental roller coaster, and I was broken and lost in every way. But then I learned I had the ability to change my own life and write my own story. So join me as I share powerful life stories, exploring the power of resilience and perseverance. Sometimes we are confronted with unexpected challenges and moments that defeat us. And it's during these dark times we question everything and lose who we are. But the human spirit possesses an immense strength that allows us to rise above the darkest moments and find the courage to rebuild our lives in unexpected and extraordinary ways. So leap into the deep end with us and head straight into the things that scare you the most. The hardest step is the first one, but once you take it, you're already one step ahead of yesterday and closer to everything you have ever dreamt of. I was on Mount Everest and the earthquake hit. I was 19 thinking, yeah, that's it, explains Alex Staniforth, motivational speaker, adventurer, and founder of Mind Over Mountains. At 9 years old, Alex encountered a mild form of epilepsy, which was the catalyst for a lot of challenges at school, including bullying for being regarded as different. After developing a stammer which crippled Alex's confidence and self-esteem, he discovered the outdoors. With a drive to push boundaries and thirst for adventure, Alex set out to summit Mount Everest in 2015. However, fate had an unexpected twist, and whilst deep in the Khumbu Icefall, the April 2015 Nepal earthquake hit, and Alex was at the epicentre of danger. Combating the aftermath of this experience, soul-searching, survivor's guilt, and acceptance followed, testing his resolve and forcing him to confront his own fears and limitations. Take your challenges and turn them into opportunities. Alex was once told, "You must grow from this, otherwise it's going to grow on you." Alex, thank you for joining me today. How are you?
Great to be here. Yeah, good, thanks. Busy. I think everyone's busy at the moment, but busy with positive things. So yeah, really good to share the story today.
Awesome. So obviously, we're going to talk about who you are and where you are today. But what I find really interesting is to kind of go back now and kind of start with the very beginning or somewhere along the past, which helps shape who you have become. So it is over to you. And kind of if you let, the audience know what you think is interesting to, the story of Alex and who you've become today.
Great, thanks. Well, where to start? I guess I'll give a bit of a brief autobiography,
Yeah.
a very short version of the book, I guess. So yeah, so I'm Alex. Obviously, I live in Kendal. I'm from Chester originally, um, and I guess to start with, I probably was the last person you'd expect to be doing what I'm doing now. I don't want people to think that there's some kind of natural gift or talent. I think I've just kind of fallen into where I am. Um, so where did it begin? I guess I had a pretty normal start in life,
Mhm.
as normal as you might think. My parents gave me a great start, so I had everything I needed. Um, and I was brought up in a small place near Chester called Kelsall,
Mhm.
which not much happened there, but nice and green, and I loved being outside. Um, and it was all kind of pretty standard until I was about 9 years old, and I had a mild form of epilepsy,
Mhm.
which was soon brought under control by medication, and I've not had a seizure for 15 years, I think. And I'm really fortunate for that, obviously, for the things I do now. Um, But that was just the catalyst for lots of challenges. It's such a kind of formative time in your life, and you're
Yeah.
trying to work out who you are and what you're doing and all these things. It was a lot of anxiety, and having, you know, having seizures led to kind of panic attacks and anxiety. And I was afraid of being out of the house without my parents, for the fear of
Mhm.
more seizures. And that really held me back at such an important time. So that was the first thing, but then that led to being, badly bullied all the way through school, because I was different, and that's like the worst thing you can be at that age. Um, I hated sports. I just detested exercise at the time. I remember coming second to last in cross country in the first year of high school, um, and doing everything I could to avoid it. Um, I think most interestingly, I've had a stammer all my life, which I've never known life without the stammer. Um, And I'm very much covert, which doesn't mean I'm a spy. It just means I'm very good at hiding it, you know. And so a lot of people don't actually notice it, but
Yeah.
I'm very aware of that, and that has obviously crippled my confidence and self-esteem for a very long time. Um, the stammer can be so bad that I've literally, you know, smashed up phones at home just for the frustration of being unable to say my own name.
Yeah.
Years ago, I could not have done this now. Um, and it's weird. I've always struggled with words to be able to see K. And at the start, you know, we spoke about holidays, and I couldn't say where I wanted to go first time. Um, so when you live in Kelsall and now live in Kendal, struggling with K words really isn't ideal. Maybe that's why I haven't climbed Kilimanjaro yet. But basically, you know, I was a victim at school. You know, life was
Mhm.
hard as I knew it. Not as hard as some people, but it's all relative. Um,
Yeah.
and I guess in a very brief nutshell, I found the outdoors. The outdoors saved me. It helped me to really find myself, to
Mhm.
really find the confidence I never had. You know, to find a way to achieve, to prove myself, and to prove all the bullies wrong. And 4 years later, what do I think? I was about 14 when I went on my first hill walk in the Lake District.
Yeah.
And that was that kind of light bulb moment, like, wow, this is the world out there. Wow, this is cool. Um, at some point that day, I'd asked myself the question, where is Mount Everest? And a very short version of the story is, you know, literally 4 years later, I was on my first Everest expedition, age 18. Um, didn't plan for it to go that quickly, but, you know, life throws things at us. Life happens, gets in the way, as we say. And so that didn't go to plan. I guess I'll talk more about that
Yeah.
shortly. And to kind of encapsulate all that, you know, my purpose now is around, you know, overcoming challenges and, you know, like you, helping other people to
Mhm.
overcome theirs too.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing, and I think this is what I've learned from a lot of the people that I speak to, probably nearly everybody, is that what we've been through and what you've been through, and we've all been through individually, it is first of all it is all relative, but how different our lives become and how we want to how much we want to help people from what we've been through to, you know, the other people that are going through either similar or very dissimilar things.
Mm.
And what is so interesting about your story as well is that, again, everybody finds different, whether it's coping mechanisms or different things that are their light bulb moment, or, you know, spark them, give them a passion. And the outdoors, I mean, I love the outdoors. I was discussing this before. You know, I believe that the mountains are my home. So it's really interesting also to find somebody that understands that as well, because sometimes a lot of people don't kind of understand why the outdoors does this to people, how it makes people feel. And this is obviously why, you know, we're sharing your story as well, because you discovered it and finding the outdoors has changed your life. And this is kind of the interesting part of is finding out more about how and why, and especially what happened on Everest.
Yeah, so if that's a question around why it helps, I think we're all trying to work out that, you know, uh, it just feels like it's intrinsically where we're meant to be,
Yeah.
you know. And I moved, you know, about 4 years ago, I moved to actually, you know, actually, in the mountains, you know, I moved, you know, to Kendal on the South Lakes for that
Mhm.
same reason, just because it's my happy place and it's healing. It's been therapy for me at the time as well. Um, and I think it's just intrinsically who I am and where we are meant to be, and we've lost touch with that. Um, I think it's the ability to almost strip everything back to the core basics.
Yeah.
And as a kid, I think what it was that ability to actually, you know, it was just me versus the environment.
Yeah.
Like there was, you know, the bullies couldn't get me. It was purely down to my ability to deal with the situation, to keep
Mhm.
putting one foot in front of the other. Um, and I think that's where the confidence came in, because I was entirely responsible for that kind of success and
Yeah.
achievement. And then you build that resilience, you build that tolerance, you build that confidence for everyday life, and it doesn't make you invincible by you know, by any means. Um, Confidence and anxiety is very situational. You know, put me on a stage in front of 300 people, or put me on a mountain in a storm, and you know, on my own, I've lost the map and cold, I'm wet. I'm in my element. Put me in a bar with strangers, and I'd rather like run a mile and hide in the box. You know, um, so it's just about me tools and finding ways of coping. And I think when I go into the outdoors, it's that ability to put things
Yeah.
in perspective. You know, that actually in the pandemic, for example. thank goodness we didn't get stuck inside, because it would have been a very different story for me. The ability to go out, to go on a run at sunset and just to look around me and think, the world is chaos right now, but out here it's business as usual.
Yeah, I love that. And no, I do. I love that. And I think getting outdoors, going for walks, especially during COVID, did help a lot of people mentally. But it going for a sunset sunrise run or a walk or being outdoors in nature, it does something so different to people that I guess it's kind of hard to describe. And it's amazing that, like I said, that you found something, especially quite early on in your teenage years, that has helped then shaped you to become who you are, and face these challenges and almost look back on the past, especially to the bullies and things like that, and show up to who you are in a completely different way, but to who you are, and who kind of true to yourself completely.
Yeah, and I think at that age you're trying to fit in, you're trying to
Yeah.
kind of be like everybody else, and I have absolutely no desire to fit in, but it's very easy to get pulled back into that. And I think the outdoors was a way of being different, but I wasn't afraid of. Like the
Yeah.
epilepsy, the stammer, all that made me different. And so the outdoors was kind of a way of carving my path into that, having my own space.
Yeah.
And there was always an element of, wanting to kind of be better than the bullies and prove them wrong. And that was the best motivation for me. But that obviously wasn't sustainable. It gets
Yeah.
to the point when there's nothing left to prove. You
Yeah.
can't be motivated by that. Um, but I think it's, yeah, I think it was that element of just um, being in a safe space, knowing where you belong, and a lot of the difficult times after that, after Everest, etc., have been when I've not really felt like I've not really knowing where I belong, not really
Yeah.
being in my space, and very much not interested in being in the crowd. It's difficult because nowadays we're exposed to that.
Yeah.
Like by this age, you should have this, and that. It's like, to hell with that. I just want to climb mountains. Um, so yeah, it's a really interesting time. But I'm really grateful that it's sort of taken me on that path, I guess.
Definitely, definitely. So I want to know. Well, I want to know as well as I'm sure everybody else does. What happened on Everest then?
So some people may have seen the Netflix documentary Aftershock. Um, I decided to watch that with my mum after I had an operation, which probably wasn't the best thing to watch together. That was the story of basically what happened the second time around. Probably not my best decision. So throwback to 2014. So I was 18 at the time. I would have been the second youngest Brit to climb Everest. That was kind of how I managed to get the sponsorship together.
Mm-hmm.
I had to raise sort of 35 grand by myself. My job as a pot washer in the local pub wasn't going to pay for it, so I was going to have to find a way I'll make one,
Mm-hmm.
basically. Um, Joined a team led by a guy called Tim Mosdale, who
Mm-hmm.
did he took me on my first rock climb in Borrowdale, like 2010. I wanted to be on his team. His ethos, his whole approach was exactly it, and he was like a mentor as well. So managed to get the funds together, managed to get the training, climbing in the Alps, climbing in the Himalayas, climbing in Scotland, jumping the hoops basically. And you kind of naively think at 18, oh, the harder you work, then the more lucky you'll get, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're taught in school how to succeed, but we're not taught how to fail. Um, and a day before we got to base camp, about 3 weeks in of this 2 month trip in Nepal, there was a massive avalanche in the icefall, which sadly killed 16 Sherpas. So we had to pack up and go home without stepping a single foot on the mountain. Now, obviously, we have no right to complain. We're going home safe to our families, and we can try again. The mountain will always be there. People always said, I'm like, I know the mountain will be there, but you don't quite appreciate what it's taken to get there.
Yeah.
Um, I think that for me was the main lesson around failure and risk, and so much is outside of our control. You know, and that's where I think this fear of failure actually became redefining failure as actually it's only a failure if we don't get back up. It's only a
Mm-hmm.
failure if we don't actually find the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, I went home, trained harder, used this as an opportunity to come back stronger, raise the money again, and was back in there in 2015 with Tim on the same team. Uh, this time, you think, well, what could possibly go wrong? Um, so we left base camp in the early hours of the 25th of April and went up to Camp 1 for the first time. So for those who don't know, there's 4 camps on the south side below the summits, and you have to move up and down them a number of times in rotations. And we left base camp about 5 o'clock that morning for the first trip up through the icefall, which is the most dangerous part of the entire route. And we were just below Camp 1, about 6,000 meters, when the earthquake hit Nepal. So we got hit by this big blast of powder, which at that age, you can only assume the worst. And I remember being on my own in the icefall. The fog was so thick in the valley that day that you don't really have any spatial awareness. It was quite hard to work out where we are and the kind of mass of this thing. And yeah, just getting hit by this big suffocating blast of white, and the first time in my life at 19 thinking, right, that's it. And so it's interesting because it's like 8 years last week, and sometimes the goosebumps just get me. So then we all somehow made it to Camp 1 unharmed. Our whole team were up there. The debris, the ice that you'd expect, never hit us somehow. We just got this big blast of wind. But now the route down to base camp was gone. We've got food for a couple of days at most. We're told we could be there for a week. Every half an hour, you've got aftershocks and avalanches hitting us from both sides. And all we can do is sit there and wait. So we spent 2 days stuck up there while all this is going on, not actually knowing that we've been in the safest place of all. That the base camp down below had just been wiped out by this much bigger avalanche triggered by the earthquake. And I'll never forget, getting on my satellite phone, calling home about half an hour after this had all kicked off. And my mum was all excited and relieved and excited. She was so pleased to hear from me. She was like, "Oh, how are you feeling? How's it going?" And I was like, "Right, listen, there's been a slight problem, And that heartbreak of hearing her cursing and screaming and crying at me halfway across the world, and there was nothing I could do at the moment. We're in the situation. We've just got to make the best out of it. So that was kind of what happened. We got airlifted down 2 days later to this carnage. Sadly, 3 of our Sherpas hadn't made it, and 20 people at base camp had gone that day, including 9,000 lives across Nepal. We were just a tiny part in this global disaster. So that obviously didn't quite go to plan, and I guess the question at the time was, how on earth do you bounce back from that? How? And all that followed that was a lot of soul searching, kind of a lot of guilt, post-traumatic stress, probably. Why them? Why not me? You can't really train for that. Nobody can really train for that, especially not at that age. And so it was probably the most challenging time of my life, because there's this loss of purpose. The outdoors gives us that sense of purpose, and as you say, that ability to help others and make a difference. And then all of a sudden you're left with this kind of midlife crisis, thinking, what's this all about?
I think, so you were on the Khumbu Icefall during the earthquake. And I think hearing that, I've only ever seen, obviously I haven't been, but only ever seen pictures and videos, and to be there, of all places, because that's the most dangerous part kinda of the route on Everest, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's strange because I was so knackered that day that I didn't actually feel the earthquake. I don't know how, because most of my team, they'd raced well ahead of me. And I remember chatting to my tent mate in ESC Camp 1, and he mentioned about the earthquake. And I was like, what do you mean earthquake? And he's like, didn't you feel it? Because for them at Camp 1, they literally been lying in the tents. It'd been like a bouncy castle. The whole ground was just up and down, up and down, up and down. But yeah, I was so knackered on my own that you just kind of get so focused in the process that you just don't feel it. But obviously that's what had broken the ice off the mountain, and that's what had done the damage.
Yeah. And that's a lot to take on. Any age, but so young at 19 years old, and you're still, you're technically still developing, you're still technically, you're figuring yourself out. It's, your teenage years and your early 20s is where I think a lot of people are figuring out who they are, figuring out a lot about themselves. So to throw that in the mix as well. So how did you start to, how did you start to show up again, face your fears? How did you start to kind of turn things around for yourself?
I think initially there's about acceptance.
Yeah.
That's always to me the first step is actually okay. The more you try and argue and fight it and deny it, you're just never going to move forwards. So you've got to accept the pain, And at first, like my family, I think mum especially, we're really close. I'm an only child, at least until she got the dog, and now that's the favourite child. It was that sense of like I didn't really want to be anywhere. I didn't want to be at home. I felt guilty. Like, why am I home? Why not the Sherpas? I would have happily swapped places. Um, and I think initially I just kind of shut myself away because nobody else could really understand unless they were on my team.
Yeah.
There was a lot of survivor's guilt, especially seeing things at base camp that, yeah, I mean, and I only saw a very filtered version of that. I'm grateful, but, you know, stuff that you're not trained to deal with. Um, there's that initial kind of just closing yourself away and not really knowing how to deal with it. So you just kind of put it in a box to one side and just push it away. Um, but I did what I'd always done, and all I knew was to try and find an opportunity. Try and make something good out of this. Like I'd been saved for some reason, and I had an obligation to the Sherpas to try and make that count. So after probably a couple of weeks of just kind of burying myself, I just got back out there, and started, right, how can I make a difference to people in Nepal who've lost
Yeah.
everything? But it wasn't, that's probably fair to say that it wasn't just like a switch. I remember a good friend of mine, Rich, who he kept calling me. I think it must have been about a week later or a few days later was, and I was still very much in this guilt mindset. And Rich had been in the army. He at my age, he'd been, in wars. He'd been shot at and had to see much worse things. Um, and he just gave me this really like tough love, like ex-military approach. And he was like, this is probably the best thing that's ever happened to you. And he said, you've got to grow from this, otherwise it's going to grow on you. I'll never forget that. I was in my bedroom at the time when I spoke to him, and it was just what I needed. It wasn't easy to hear, but he
Yeah.
was right. And basically, I just went 100 miles an hour. I threw myself into fundraising. I decided if I couldn't climb Everest, I was going to cycle it. So found a hill in the Pennines, cycled up and down it non-stop for about 21 hours. It's about 29,000 vertical feet.
Yeah.
As a fundraiser, you've got to think differently.
Yeah.
Started writing my first book, Icefall, which obviously wasn't the book we planned to write. But when this all kicked off, I thought, well, that's the book gone. I actually said, no, this is a really unique story. So it's like,
Yeah.
great. Okay. I moved. So I moved to the lakes that summer for about 2 months to work in a youth hostel. Again, for kind of healing and therapy, the lakes helped me to process it all. Being in my own space, being in my happy space. I then moved back home because I was spending too much time on my bike and not enough time writing. Um, and now speaking, I'd already kind of fallen into speaking by this
Yeah.
point at a low level. But that summer, I had about 2 or 3 months of speaking where it was just an ordeal. Like, I think it was the trauma was so raw that sometimes I'd used to stand and speak and I would just freeze. I had to sit down and go out the room. And I very, very nearly binned that speaking career off because every time I stood up, it was just an ordeal. And it was probably too soon. It was probably too raw, but I felt I had to share it.
Mm.
Um, I remember like the power of vulnerability. Just one day I had a speaking gig to a load of like young footballers, about 150 in a room, and oh, I literally had a sick note drafted in my email inbox. But giving up just isn't in my values. It's just not
Yeah.
what I do. And I think something that day I stood up and I froze. Like 150 people gave me that kind of puzzled look, and something just took over me. And I remember that keynote being probably one of the most powerful I've ever done, because it's something just came out of nowhere, and the
Yeah.
feedback is probably the best I've ever had off a keynote, even now with a lot more experience, and hopefully better than I was back then. Um, and that's what kept me going. That one keynote turned it round. But sorry, to answer your question, basically, I just did a lot of fundraising, a lot of stuff. I just kept doing one thing and one thing and one thing. Um, but I think in hindsight, I'd kind of been running away from it.
Yeah.
I'm not really kind of processed it. I was just avoiding it, and eventually it caught up with me. Um, but as always, it's thinking of the Sherpas, the most resilient people you'd ever meet. And they had lost everything, yet still gave so much. So
Yeah.
that was my inspiration.
Yeah. I mean, what the Sherpas do, just to say is I just think one of the most incredible things that I think anyone really could ever do. I watch, when I watch documentaries and I hear stories about them, I just think the bravery and the courage and the resilience that these people have is outstanding. It's almost not like human. It's outstanding, and I think that they deserve so much more appreciation and respect than the rest of the world, I think, truly gives them. First of all, just to say, because it is amazing what they do, and they help so many people and they support so many people, every day, especially on the mountains.
Yeah, I mean, they are superhuman. They are the
Yeah.
most resilient people I've ever met, and I'm really grateful to call them friends. And we couldn't do what we do on the mountains without them, for sure.
Yeah.
To an element that is in their blood, it's genetic. It's all they've ever known.
Yeah.
These are the sort of people where literally from kids they're literally running up hills to get to school. They live in the mountains. It's all they know.
Yeah.
So that conditioning obviously gives them that resilience. But um, I've been really fortunate to spend a lot of time in the mountains, and the saddest part is that they were the ones who were worst affected by this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you about my friends at Atashi and Lappa down in Kayanjuma, and on the way out of base camp, after all this had happened, they were okay, they were unharmed, the house was standing. They had this big crack down the front wall, but they were fine. And yet, even so, Tashi was bringing us in with, apple pie and Snickers bars and prawn crackers and all sorts. And she said, we're not paying, we're part of their family now. And it's like, we're not even the victims here. This is just staggering.
Yeah.
And um, then again, I went back to Nepal in 2017. This time was a solo trek, just to try and process all this
Yeah.
and put it to bed, with the view of going back to Everest one day. And by chance, Tashi and Lapka's tea house had actually burnt down about a week before, a freak fire. They were safe again, but they'd lost everything.
Yeah.
As I got there, you just don't know what to say. I managed to raise some money for them and, literally put a post on social media and got them something. And yet Lapka was just smiling. He's like, don't worry, we're going to build a better house. This one was rubbish. I was like, what? Yeah, your house is burnt down. What? Because they look for the opportunity,
Yeah.
and that for me has been an inspiration. Is if that happened to us, I know if that happened to my house, I wouldn't be so positive about it.
And what I really like about what you just said, the story you just mentioned about the Sherpa, and then that it inspires you, because I can see that it inspired you, because some of the things that you were saying just before that as well, I was going to say what you've done, and then obviously what's happened with regards to obviously the house catching on fire, is taking an opportunity, sorry, taking a challenge, not an opportunity, taking a challenge that has happened in your life, their life, whoever's life, and turning it into an opportunity. So being able to take the challenge and making an opportunity out of it. And you have done that. You've been able to do that. Things that have come up and challenges that you faced, you were able to turn into opportunities to then grow from and change your life from. And something that you said before, which was about the book, and you said, oh, scrap the idea, it's finished. But instead of kind of dismissing it completely and giving up, you actually realize, wait a minute, I'm not going to give up on this. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to adapt. I'm going to change it. And I'm going to now write a different book on something new, something else that has happened, something that I didn't think about, say, yesterday. And I think that's what's so interesting, is that if you hit a wall, or you hit something and you think, I'm going to give up, because it hasn't worked out how you want it to work out, instead of giving up, there is so many different ways that you can do something, and that is exactly what you have done.
Thanks. I've certainly tried my best. It just feels instinctive now, going back to that early hill walk at,
Yeah,
at 9 years old, and then finding the outdoors, and wanting to keep pushing the bar
yeah,
higher and higher. What else can I achieve? Um, so it's kind of instinctive, and for me, that is the basis of resilience. It's the ability to keep moving forwards.
yeah,
But the main lesson from Everest was actually, I naively thought at 18 that when I got to Everest, that everything would be complete.
yeah,
That I can rest on my laurels. I've achieved my life goal, and that everything would just fall into place.
yeah,
And nothing else really mattered. Um, and so when it all fell apart, it was that real sense of kind of grief and loss of almost
yeah,
like, what am I going to do? How am I going to fulfill my, how am I going to make my life count anymore? How can anything else possibly fill that gap?
yeah,
Um, but fortunately, I guess I realized that actually Everest was just the start, and actually Everest was just part of something much bigger.
yeah,
Um, and I was able to find kind of new challenges that achieve the same kind of benefit, the same kind of personal goal. And you realize that, Everest itself is like big mountains. It is kind of very much a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy. You want to
mhm,
reach the top of the mountain and place the flag, and that's great. But then you come back down again, and then what's next? And then what's
yeah,
next? And then what's next? Um, and after Everest, I actually went back to try and climb the sixth highest peak in the world, Choyu in Tibet.
mhm.
I didn't reach that one either, just in case anyone wondered. Um, got to about 7,000 meters, and then it was the altitude that got me.
Yeah,
I remember having this like moment, looking back, thinking, if I'd been in that tent on Everest the year before, our tents at base camp were just torn apart like a piece of paper, buried under about a foot of snow and rock. It's like, what would I have left behind? And that feeling of like, what's this all about?
yeah,
And having closure with Everest, and actually thinking, right, how can I make a bigger difference close to home? So it was actually just an opportunity to come up with more challenges, and climbing the UK was the next big one. That was
yeah,
cycling, running, walking, kayaking to the highest points of all the counties in the UK. Um, and that was like the first time I'd actually achieved what I set out to do. But
yeah,
again, it comes down to that ability to keep moving forwards. Um, Even though I didn't achieve the goal, I'm fortunate that kind of speaking got bigger and
yeah,
busier. Um, and that's now my main work, and it's like the most rewarding job in the world, because people have heard lots of stories about success in business and sport and adventure, but actually I think people need to know how to deal with failure.
yeah,
Um, and I hope that's what can interest them. Um, Starting a charity, Mine Over Mountains, is nearly 3 years old, and that has kind of become my legacy. I didn't expect to be doing that this early in my life, but we're all on borrowed time, as I learned on Everest, and there's definitely a need to do it. So,
yeah.
these all things have all come out off the back of that negative experience. So yeah, I think there's always a silver lining, right?
Yeah, yeah, there really is always a silver lining. And if you don't see it, the moment it's happened, the following week, the following month, the following year, if you just keep going, and I know that's so hard to say, to keep going, because it's really hard to keep going. It is. But if you just keep going and you just don't give up, that silver lining will show. It will show, and it will come out in a way that, however many years ago, you never ever 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 anticipated or thought would happen, and it just shows up one day, and you have that moment, and you kind of think, oh, wait a minute, this is this it?
Yeah, as you say, it probably comes when you least expect it,
Yeah,
and only when you stop grappling with it and trying to fight it and trying to control it can that
yeah,
happen. Um, like, to give you another little story, last year, it's April last year. I did probably my last long run,
mhm,
in the lakes, meres, and waters, and I trained for everything, but then something you don't expect to happen. 2 days later, a COVID finally got me, and since then I've been on this pretty rubbish expedition with long COVID. And so not being able to run, not being able to do my usual things, which is kind
yeah,
of how I express myself. That's how I
yeah,
manage anxiety. That's everything, is suddenly taken away. And at the time, there was this sense of, just trying to fight it like I the same way I had all my other challenges, and you realize that this isn't going to work.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of depression involved with that. There was a lot of, it was probably the hardest year of my life for sure, because there was no time scale. It wasn't like an illness or an injury where you can say, right, this will take 6 months, a year, etc.
Yeah.
I didn't know whether I'd ever get back to running again. And when I stopped kind of grappling with it, it was like, I need to just focus on what I can control.
Yeah.
And that was, okay, happiness and joy and success is often something we kind of cast into the future. It's like, oh, well, when I get there, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
But then it's, what can I do to find some joy in the moment right now? And I discovered open water. So I started like jumping in tarns and lakes in the Lake District and just fell in love with it. And that has now become part of the toolkit. And I'm glad to say I'm back running now, making a very, very, very slow comeback. But that kind of, silver lining kind of emerged at the time. But now when I look back at it, things happen in such an order sometimes that there has to be some kind of coincidence to it. There is some meaning behind it. I really believe that.
Yeah. I believe it as well. I believe
So,
it as well, and that's a huh?
it's
Yeah,
a thing of it.
yeah, and that's a completely different. We could talk about that for a very long time, and I do believe it as well. But I think what again is really interesting, and what you just said is as well, is that again you were faced with another challenge, not being able to run because of what happened, and yet you then discovered open water swimming, and even that, it just shows your resilience of you were faced with a challenge again, and then you found an opportunity, and who knows where that's going to take you, because I've heard some pretty cool stories about that as well. So that could be the beginning of your journey with outdoor open water swimming. So it's really interesting how, well, you're right, how it's not coincidental, and how things happen almost methodically in life. But I do also want to ask, and you said that you hadn't processed what happened with Everest for a very long time. Have you processed it now?
Great question. I don't think I ever will fully. I
Yeah.
think you live with it. I think it's become a key part of me and my story. I'm not defined by it, but it's part of me now. I think these things that happen to us, they become part of our strength. Um, uh, when it was the anniversary, like quite recently, 8 years, it's interesting because I'd almost forgotten about it because I've been so busy. It's a classic thing. Until a friend who was on my team had posted the photo that
Yeah.
I got a photo at base camp with the 3 names of our Sherpas. And when I saw that on social media, I just remember like this sudden, you know, goosebumps and welling up the tears.
Yeah.
And so clearly there's still some trauma there. I think to an extent, there is still this feeling of like needing to, you know, make life count. There is a
Yeah.
pressure to really push the bar, which is a good motivator as long as it's kept in check, because it's okay not to be on our A game all the time.
Yeah.
Um, I'd like to think I've already made a difference, but there's plenty more I want to do in my lifetime. Um, but I think I'm quite quickly, I think I was able to like not blame, not kind of complain about it. I think not to be a victim. And so I've never really felt like a victim. Some people on the team, some people there, I know that they're still a bit like, oh, why that happened to us, and
Yeah.
that doesn't help anybody. Um, but I'm so used to talking about it now. I mean, I'm speaking about it all the time, in businesses and school and writing, that it's not that it doesn't affect me. I'm just used to it. We get
Yeah.
used to telling the story. But there is definitely an element of kind of trauma there,
Yeah.
that probably manifests in ways I've not necessarily seen. You know, um, Whenever I've had kind of other experiences, I think it's kind of really brought that back.
Yeah.
I didn't get treatment for that, so maybe I should have done. Maybe I still need to. Um, but I've been able to use it as a force for good, I think. So as long as I can keep doing that, I think I'll be okay. But when I went back to Nepal in 2017, I think that helped to heal it, because I was able to
Yeah.
kind of kind of have a corrective experience where essentially trying to replace those negative ones with a more positive
Yeah.
brain. But I'm really grateful it happened, not for everybody else, but
Yeah.
for the fact that it's given me that perspective of what's important.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's really interesting because I think nearly everyone I've spoken to, or that I just meet in general, they are grateful for what they have been through. And I know, I mean, I'm grateful for what I've been through, but it still amazes me to hear so many other people say exactly the same thing. And I just think that in itself, just that sentence, should hopefully inspire so many people. I might not, which is fine, but if it does, that's what's so amazing about stories and about what we've been through. And just everything in general with regards to, like I said, what we've been through in the stories, and following on through to the future of what you want to do and how you can change your own life. And kind of with regard to that, I wanted to ask you then, so what's one piece of advice, or what's advice that you would give to somebody that is at that challenge? So they are right in the midst of their challenge right now. And I know everyone's challenges are very different. I know that, but they are right in the middle of their challenge right now. And what would you say to them? What's the one thing that you would say?
One thing, wow.
All
Um,
right.
think back to the point before around, thinking Everest was the be all and end all.
Yeah,
It's never too late to reinvent yourself. And that feels like a really sad process. It feels like, but I don't want to lose that. And actually, it's never quite as breathing as you might think,
yeah,
to almost lose part of ourselves, because we don't lose it, we just evolve. And I'm still getting back to running, and I've got plenty of goals, but now I have other things as well. And you
yeah,
realize that you're not just a runner, you're also a long list of other things. I'm also a speaker, I'm a charity founder, I'm a son, I'm a friend, I'm a mentor, etc. And you can't just be one thing. So I think not to be afraid of change,
yeah,
um, and maybe a second thing is just to trust the process. Like
yeah,
I would say that there is often experience, I think, has given me that, and I think it's maybe hard for people that are maybe in that for the first time.
yeah,
But for everything I've been through now, I just trust the process. So almost when things happen, I'm like, right then, what's this all about? And it doesn't make it easier. I still have,
yeah,
we still have the same anxieties and frustration and
yeah,
whinges and moans. And I think we all need to have a tactical moan sometime. That's perfectly normal. That's the problem is when you're a speaker, people are like, oh, but you're always meant to be really positive, and why don't you tell people what you tell them? But I'm also human, right?
yeah.
um, so yeah, trust the process is one of my favorites.
Yeah. I I laughed when you said trust the process because it's what I do.
Oh, cool,
I
cool.
yeah, I laughed because it when you said that, I laughed because it resonated so much with me. I trust the process. And it's really interesting because some people think it's crazy when I say it. But I just do and it was when you said that when you are faced with something else again, you sit there and you go, "Oh, what? Why is this happening?" But that's what made me laugh, is because I have that as well when I'm faced with something and I'm like, oh really, but I know that for whatever reason, something greater, or whether I learn something from it, something is happening for me to understand and to realize and to learn something to then move me on to the next phase in my life and to move me forward. So trust the process. 100%. I agree. So is there anything else that you wanted to talk about today or to discuss?
Um, it feels like we've had a really in-depth chat, and it's been great. I feel like I've spoken a lot about myself, but I don't know whether it's worth talking around, um, like the people around me, like support team, and almost what people can do if they're trying to help somebody in that position. Maybe is that
Yeah.
worth going?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely.
So do you want me to dive into that, or
Yeah, yeah, go
what's
on.
happening?
Yeah, so it'd be interesting then to hear kind of what, you were saying about support and having the right people, not even the right people, but having certain people
Mm,
around you, definitely, because that's so important.
sure. So I guess from a young age, or fairly young age, I mean, I've been fortunate to have a lot of good mentors and coaches that I've kind of just stumbled across. I've not intentionally gone out to find them,
Yeah.
but I think when you have questions and when you're trying to achieve a big goal, people have this inclination that they want to kind of give you that kind of step up.
Yeah.
So that's been great. And it's not about having lots and lots of people. I think it's having an intentional circle.
Yeah.
Um, and that has grown throughout this. Some people that I maybe less in touch with. With my first mentor, Chris, we actually started. So he's now kind of a co-founder in the charity. So we've kind of grown from a mentoring to now a partnership. Which is great. But I think it's also about having the people that will tell you what you need to hear rather than just what you want to hear. And I'm sure you have the same when you go through a horrible, horrible experience, and it's life changing and scary and all that. It's um, there's often a tendency, I think, for people to try and sort of they want to fix, they want to give you the answer, they don't know what to tell you. And I think the advice I'd give to anybody that if they are trying to help, someone who they know, if it's a family member, etc., um, through that is actually um, it's more important to try and understand rather than try and fix. It's almost actually what do you need rather than you know how can I solve that? Because frankly, we probably know the solutions ourselves. Maybe there isn't a solution. I think sometimes just to actually listen to unconditionally accept people for what they're going through, and if it's not something they've experienced, it's really hard for them to be in your shoes. I think that the whole thing about it could be worse, so cheer up is just should be banned. I hate that because it's all relative to our own experiences, as I said before. But what's I think what's been key for me is actually in those moments of doubt and confidence is actually having people that have been there before can be the proof that it can be done. And it doesn't need to be lots of people, just one person who believes in you and can say the right thing at the right moment, I think has been absolutely instrumental to me as well. And now I'm trying to, pay that forward. I think, again, back to being outside, when you're in the mountains, it's so much easier to open up, to walk and talk. And yeah, I don't know how those people came into the journey. I think if we show up as ourselves, if we be authentic, if we ask for help, we'll often get what we need.
Yeah. And I think that in itself it's almost the nail on the head, is that you're right. If we just show up and we're authentic to who we are, the right people that are meant to come into our lives, whatever the reason, to help us in whatever way, they will show up. And if you're feeling, I think for general, for anybody, if you're feeling that at the moment in this time that you don't think there's anyone coming and there's no one coming to help you, or you just don't see that, I actually think it's the opposite, because so many more people show up in our life almost after we've been through what we've been through, and then it's the right people that are meant to be in our lives show up afterwards. So if you're in a place where you're feeling like there's not many people at the moment, there will be, as long as, like you said, we are authentic and we keep showing up, because they again, I can't explain how, but they arrive. They do. They
Yeah.
just arrive.
They have a strange knack of doing that, don't they? And you realise who's important because they're the ones that do come and do help. And yeah, I think they've often done that to me for nothing in return other than just to pay it forward. And so I've
Yeah.
tried to pay that forward as much as I can. Like turning a challenging experience into a positive, I think is just really important. And yeah, there's nothing else to add to that really. I think one kind of quote that our leader Tim always used to kind of say at Everest was that it doesn't matter how good your support team is, though, you're the only one who can take the first step. And there is always an element of ownership that even with the Sherpas around you, our team had over 55 summits of Everest, between them. Absolute machines. I couldn't do it once, blimey. Then only you can take responsibility for that. And that's kind of the hard part, is getting people to do that.
Yeah. The first step's always the hardest. Whatever it is in life. Whatever it is in life, the first step is always the hardest. But once you take that first step, the journey, however long it takes, however hard it takes, however high it is, um, it's an amazing journey. And I think that's kind of the summary. It's an amazing journey once you take that first step. And it doesn't matter if you don't reach the top of the mountain, because actually it's the journey that's taken you along that way. and then it leads you to completely other journeys, completely other different, different paths, different mountains, different things in your life, is where I think is hugely important. So yeah.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And it's not going to be easy, but I think that's, for me, challenges and what make life kind of meaningful.
Yeah.
It's how we respond to them. It's how we get back up. And I've dropped that in there again. Um,
Thanks.
because it is important, because that's the thing, is like, you've got to be willing to take the risk
Yeah.
to learn all that. I don't know any different now. I don't think I'd ever be comfortable without risk and without things going
Yeah.
wrong. Because that's kind of where I thrive. So yeah,
Yeah.
let's keep setting challenges and keep kind of, getting back up again, I guess.
Yeah. And I just want to say before we finish that I know you're making a difference. I know you're making a difference, and whether that's one person's life today and X many people's lives, tomorrow or in a year, you are making a difference. And I think that you should be told that, whether you know that or you don't. I think that you should be told that, because it's incredible what you're doing, and from what you've been through to where you are now, and just the story in general, you are making a difference to people's lives. So thank you.
Appreciate that as well. I think, yeah, I guess I know I am, but maybe just not as much as I want. It's that classic perfectionist thing, always wants it doing more and bigger. But at the end of the day, a great mentor said this to me last week. You know, you only have to change kind of one life at a time.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I do appreciate that, and it's kind of just thank you. Plus as well, I think this is a great platform, and I hope this will, so no doubt get people when they need that kind of inspiration as well. So thank you for doing all this, as well, and I think it's a great platform.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and I really appreciate what you just said. So thank you very much for joining me.
And it's been fun. I hope people will enjoy the talk, and yeah, it's been really fun to chat. I mean, again, a lot of podcasts I do tend to be quite kind of broad around outdoors and then the same questions, and it's just a joy to speak to somebody at the same sort of place around, somebody on the same page, around something so specific. So yeah, it's been really fun. So thank you for having me on, and I will thank Dominic as well, who introduced us.
Yeah, definitely. And you know what? You've inspired me. Well, not even inspired me. I really want to go outdoors now.
So that's a result in itself. Yeah, well, hopefully you get some more outdoors planned. And yeah, I'm in the South Lakes, so if you ever up for like a walk or a climb, then let me know. I'm not really a climber anymore. I can, but I'm more of a hill walker, runner now. So
No. Hiking the hills. That's perfect. It's more what I want to do as well. So 100%, I will take you up on that offer.
It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Alex. Thank you for joining me. So this week, think about the mountains that you want to conquer. Not just the physical mountains outdoors, but your individual mountains to climb. How can you turn your challenges into opportunities? Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.